So we see him not only changing his mind about some things like the US Constitution, we see him doubling down on other principles, the place of violence, having a place on the table in the abolitionist struggle. And there are also places where there is ambiguity. And for me, the fun part of this deep dive historically into Frederick Douglass is where you see the ambiguity, the contradictions, the inner turmoil, because that is what makes us in part fundamentally human. It's not just our commitments and convictions. Yes, we have those. It's not just integrity. It's also our contradictions, right? It's also our ambiguity. And one place where there's great ambiguity in Douglass's thinking is around the role of God in this battle against slavery. Douglass did not question that there is a God and that God fights for abolition. God fights for us to honor that we are all, as humans, created in the image and likeness of God. But Douglass began to question what is God's role in the fight for abolition and freedom, and what is our role? And so you'll hear Douglass at times use the kind of language of we have to wait upon God to lead, to fight. But you'll also find Douglass using the language of all the prayers of Christendom will not stop one single bullet from its course, meaning that it really is up to us. God has God's realm, we have our realm, and it's through our action that we change the day, that we turn the tide, that we end slavery. But where does God fit in that human action? Interpreters of Douglass have read him differently here, hence this sense of ambiguity. For some interpreters, biographers who've written on the mind of Frederick Douglass, I'm thinking of Waldo Martin, he sees Douglass as somebody who goes from fundamental belief in God to become more of a secularist, more of a humanist, where God is pushed off stage in Douglass's thinking as he matures. You'll have others like historian David Blight, who see Douglass as maintaining a belief in God throughout his life, never pushing God off stage, but changing how God's action works within human action. I think Blight has the better argument there, that Douglass is somebody who consistently turns to God, but never in a way that absolves us of our moral agency. We must act, and we must act for the good. We must act even if it requires us to put our lives on the line, even if it requires violence or fight. But in that, God is at work doing something that we are not capable of achieving, though it is through our agency that God's will is effective. So Douglass uses different kinds of language, and as you turn to some of the speeches and his editorials, you'll find elements of the Black Jeremiad, a way of interpreting where God is in terms of the violence that is gripping the nation and the violence that was expected in a civil war, developed through African-American lens, or the lens of African-American experience. You'll find those elements running through Douglass's speeches and editorials. And you'll also find a kind of hope. And the hope at times seems misplaced, because no matter how dark the situation became, no matter how difficult it became for the millions of enslaved people, Douglass still had this hope that God was doing something with this country, and through the experience of African Americans in particular, that would lead to freedom, that would lead to justice, that would lead to a better nation. So all of these elements, this mix, and you'll hear one theme, and then months, years later, Douglass speaks again, you hear a different theme that becomes prominent, but they're all there. And by the time you get to his third and final autobiography, he begins to make a bit more sense of the integrity that persists through the course of a life, even though we change our minds sometimes, even though we double down on certain convictions, whether they are right or wrong, even though there's ambiguity about some things we never resolve. By his final autobiography, you begin to see how he is Douglass with all of these ambiguities and contradictions and inner turmoils. And that is one of the things that's not just fun, but remarkable about doing a deep dive in history. We recover persons not just as icons, not just as markers for particular periods of history. If we open our eyes, if we read attentively, we see them as humans, flawed, frail, vulnerable, with a lot of unfinished business, and very often with a story to tell. And that leads me to my next point, thinking about reading Douglass today. Given the violence, given the lack of hope, given the stress that we are under because of the political debate in this country, because of the violence, particularly against Black lives, Douglass's voice is extremely helpful, a helpful conversation partner. What Douglass does well is to name what is wrong with the nation, to call it for what it is, to look very clearly at not just racial division, but at white supremacy, at the subjugation of Black people. And after calling it, to still find resources within the American experience to lead to a better day. I think that's important. To not lose hope, given the apparent hopelessness for a lot of us in this moment, but to hold on and to capture or recapture those elements of the American experience that really can lead us to a better day. I'll give you an example. Shortly after the Freedmen's Memorial was established in Washington, D.C., Frederick Douglass was invited to address the nation. As a matter of fact, no African American spoke to a larger public audience than Frederick Douglass until Barack Obama was elected president. There was the president who was there, there were Supreme Court justices, members of Congress, and Douglass spoke in honor of Abraham Lincoln and in honor of this Freedmen's Memorial that was built through money raised largely by the African American community. And what Douglass does when he has the national stage is he begins by telling the truth about the moment in which we lived. And he says to this audience, Abraham Lincoln was your president. He was somebody who fundamentally was for white people and secondarily, ancillary way, for Black people. Beginning there, Douglass names precisely what was going on politically in the nation, but he doesn't stop there, because he moves from there to identifying the Abraham Lincoln that we should remember, one who actually fought against earlier convictions, fought against this sense that if the nation could exist half slave, half free, that's a great way to go. Lincoln fought against that and began to embrace this idea of African American freedom and elevation. He doesn't get to the point of social equality, but he was moving in that direction. And Frederick Douglass, before the nation, unashamed, not embarrassed, names it, names Lincoln's flaws as part of a national story in claiming this monument and this day, and the importance of this monument in Lincoln's memory, but also in memory of the freedom of those who had been enslaved. To tell the truth, to claim even dark moments as part of a longer saga of this nation, as part of a longer story of this nation, is one of the remarkable things about Frederick Douglass that I think speaks well to us today. How do we tell the truth without fear, without shame? How do we say exactly what's going on and still claim that within a larger story of the unfolding of the United States, of the growth of a country that still has promise? And how do we do that in a way that inspires hope in millions of people? I think for thinkers today, for activists today, for those of us who feel hopeless today, Douglass's ability to do that and to do that well is remarkable and makes him a phenomenal conversation.